It's 11 hours.
Well, if everybody's there, I can't hear a word, but I will. So we're talking today about the global tax haven industry, and I'm delighted to have been involved in the Panama Papers case with Australia's ABC. They've done a documentary on it, and with Fusion Network, which has gotten access to the files. They're an exciting young TV network here in the United States. There's a network of about 110 countries involving more than 370 journalists. I've been blogging about this and making some writing about it in Foreign Affairs last week. There's a bunch of stuff on the Columbia University website that at the Center for Sustainable Investment that has some of the papers we've been doing, including a copy of this presentation that I've done. Today I want to focus in on what we learned from this kind of unusual revelation. It is, by investigative journalism standards, the largest leak in history, and involving more than 2.6 terabytes of data, 200 countries with clients. One tiny law firm in Panama, Mossack Fonseca, has been the root of all this. But they have offices in 35 countries and are networked with most of the world's largest banks. They have 500 bank clients and more than 13,500 other clients, including a lot of law firms around the planet. And they are represented in 35 havens, at least, including Panama. I first ran across them in 1987 when I was investigating General Noriega as a journalist and looking at his involvement in international drug trafficking. And at that point, Mossack Fonseca had already been in business for about 10 years. They were founded in 1977 by Jürgen Mossack from Germany. And they'd experienced quite a strong growth under Noriega and his predecessor, General Torrijos. But then in the late 80s, they fell on hard times because of the upset in Panama, and they began to diversify. They responded to that by globalizing their business. So today they're offering services to all these clients all over the world, and they've been following the growth of what we call the global haven industry along its development path. Relatively speaking, they're a pretty small firm, actually, compared to Wall Street law firms. They have about $42 million of revenue per year, 500 lawyers, 300 of whom are in Panama. Not all of them actually lawyers, 500 staff. Some of their staff are like a staff member who is a signatory on more than 24,000 Panamanian companies as a director of those companies, and she's paid $10,000 a year for that. So it's quite an experience gap there. But the firm has really thrived, I think, on secrecy and on the fact that it's offering to clients a global service involving basically off-the-shelf companies and trusts and foundations that are for which there's no beneficial ownership required. So you don't really know who owns anything, and that's essentially what Panama is trading on. Let me direct you to the PowerPoint, and I want to share this slideshow because it'll guide our thinking about this. I'm going to hold questions until maybe 20 or 30 minutes into this, and you can gather them together, and I'll respond directly to those. So I'm hoping that you can see this slideshow. The global haven industry, Panama Papers before and after. I'm going to be talking about several myths about the papers and their importance. Some of the pathologies of this global industry, which has really grown up since the 1970s and now is enormous, populated by some of the world's largest banks, law firms, and accounting firms, and not just limited to places like Panama. And then we'll talk about solutions that we have on the table, including having a global investigation of this stuff so we get at the industry once and for all. As I said already, this is the largest leak in history. 214,438 offshore companies, 100,000 of those in the BVI, which is in Delaware, in the British Virgin Islands, which is a small island off the coast of, it's sort of near the Virgin Islands. The rest of those are from 35 other financial havens, including Nevada, Wyoming, and Delaware, which have become havens for many purposes. So far, they've implicated about 22 heads of state, 143 public officials, and 61 inner circles, including sensational revelations like finding Putin's best friend, members of the Chinese president's family, the Iceland prime minister, the president of Argentina with offshore companies there, the Ukraine president, and the ownership of former President Lula's condo in Brazil, and the prime minister of the UK, David Cameron's father, had a Mossack Fonseca company. The most important thing about this, though, is not the revelations that have come out, all these sensational name droppings, but this is really the first detailed portrait that we have of the interconnections in the Global Haven network. We've already seen investigations launched by governments in 30 countries around the planet, mostly in democracies like the United States, the UK, and Iceland, not so much in kleptocracies like Russia or China. In fact, China has put this whole story off limits to their whole population. What we know about the original source of this papers is interesting. It apparently showed up out of the blue to an obscure kind of newspaper in Germany called Süddeutsche Zeitung in 2014, early 2015 was the first contact. Just basically offering this data and saying that their lives were at risk and that they were doing this out of public interest. So to this date, we have no idea who this original deep throat source is, and it makes for some interesting issues when investigative journalists, journalists in general, come to write about stories that have unnamed sources with obscure motives. But having debated with, just as recently as last week, with people like Cy Hirsch, the ethics of this, if the revelations themselves hold up, if they are basically, they're not concocted, and you can, after the journalists have done a great job of authenticating these documents to make sure that they were not fabricated, I think you can argue that journalism has a responsibility to look past the motives of whistleblowers involved. I assume whistleblowers have all kinds of motives, good and bad, for what they do. The real question is whether the material that they produce is independently valuable. And I think that this certainly passes that test. So we said that 370 journalists have been working on this in secret over the last year, and it was really a phenomenal act of collaboration across countries. The key point to make here is that this revelation did not come from law enforcement, from the NSA, or from government in general. It came from journalists and whistleblowers who've been doing this work on their own. So I think one message here is that we need to strengthen the protections for journalists and whistleblowers when it comes to this kind of unacceptable levels of financial secrecy. There is much more to come as we expand the network analysis of this data, and we begin to identify more obscure people in the databases that are connected to the powers that be. Uh, Again, just to review this firm, I've already talked about this in some detail, but the most important thing here may be the list of some of the largest banks as core clients. HSBC with more than 2,600 of these companies. That's the largest bank in the world. Credit Suisse with more than 1,200 Mossack Fonseca companies. UBS with 1,600. 16 German banks with hundreds of companies. And this is really, as we'll see, the proverbial tip of the iceberg, because this is just one Panamanian law firm. Contrary to some of the early press reports, this is not the fourth largest offshore law firm in the world. There are many like it all over the planet, including some in New York and Delaware that are offering similar kinds of financial secrecy services. The next slide, I'm talking about 7 myths about the offshore industry that we need to really be careful about. First of all, this is not a new story. We've had revelation after revelation since the 1970s involving offshore banking and global havens, beginning with the Castle Bank and Trust case, my first investigation back in the 1970s, a bank that was set up by a bunch of U.S. tax haven lawyers for their wealthy American clients. More than 200 of them were on a list of people who owned illegal offshore trusts. They were never prosecuted or brought to justice for that. There was a political fix-in at the highest levels, but the list included incredible people like the Creedence Clearwater Revival, the rock group, if you are a rock fan. And Bob Guccione of Penthouse magazine was on the list. So leading members of the Cleveland Mafia as well. But right on down from that investigation through the 1970s, we had revelations about Noriega and BCCI in early 80s, the involvement of Citibank and the Salinas case in Mexico, the Marcos money, Obasha from Nigeria. Right on down to the last decade, we've had many stories about big banks like UBS and Credit Suisse helping to arrange these kinds of offshore laundromats for their wealthiest clients, and the prosecution of leading banks like Credit Suisse for that, for helping wealthy Americans take money abroad. So there's been an awful lot of talk about the haven industry prior to this. This is the biggest revelation, and I think it's very helpful from the standpoint of one specific role, which is the focus on kleptocracy. But we do have a problem of what I call the banality of exposés. The real scandal is that governments have known about this for decades and have done nothing to fix it, and only recently have they taken any serious interest in the problem. So that's something that is an important theme that I'll return to later when we talk about solutions. Tax haven, that's a second myth. Tax havens, have been discussed widely in this scandal as if taxes were all these folks were involved in. To really appreciate what havens are all about, you have to look beyond low taxes to the role of financial secrecy. Tax Justice Network, for whom I'm a senior advisor, has a list of 91 offshore havens around the world, and there are many more if we count jurisdictions like Delaware and Nevada and Wyoming, and 49 U.S. states that don't require a beneficial ownership registration, so you can't tell who owns what. And there's 13 U.S. states that now offer asset protection trusts that are modeled on the Cook Islands, with all kinds of lax rules. So the onshore-offshore distinction really has been breaking down, and as well as this notion that it's just about dodging taxes. We do know that, as one Mossack Fonseca attorney said in an email, 95% of their clients, he estimated, were involved in tax dodging. But the real revelation here was about kleptocracy, which is the enterprise of public officials helping themselves to public assets or engaged in bribery and corruption, and then parking their wealth offshore in secret jurisdictions or onshore in secret jurisdictions. So it's really the ultimate problem is the financial secrecy of these places. And that's a kind of shared facility. You can see the Star Wars bar scene with the kleptocrats and the tax dodgers and the people engaged in financial chicanery, insider trading, arms dealing, drug dealing, all sitting around the same bar, basically sharing that same facility. We'll talk more about the other pathologies beside tax dodging below. This is, as I said, not only is it an onshore as well as offshore industry, but it's basically a huge interconnected network. Any particular haven could disappear from the face of the earth, even Panama, and the other 90 or so would pick up the business. What's behind the scenes here is this huge global industry populated by some of the world's largest banks and law firms and accounting firms, and many specialists as well. We're just using this network. And, so if Panama goes down today, they'll transfer their assets to a company elsewhere or to a company, to a corporate service provider elsewhere. It's become something of a commodity business. Indeed, one of the sad things about development strategies is quite a few offshore havens have developed, on the theory that they would find the road to riches through establishing copycat kind of facilities. And they quickly discovered that the world really revolves around a dozen or so havens that have been around a long time. Panama is one of those, but BVI, Cayman Islands, Bermuda, Singapore, Hong Kong, these are all established havens. And most of the new players that have entered this industry in the last 2 decades have not done well. Countries like Vanuatu and Niue, setting up havens. The exception to that is perhaps the U.S. domestic states like Wyoming and Nevada, and the Mauritius, which has been very successful in Africa based on it, providing favorable investment vehicles to India in particular. Anyway, I was going to cite the example of Credit Suisse as this a great story about this network that exists. They have a law firm called Lenz & Stacheli that nobody has heard of, but very influential in Switzerland. And they don't bother to have a network of relationships around the planet. They just basically deal with Credit Suisse and then call other law firms to handle their clients. But Credit Suisse today has a presence in 41 countries, more than 26,000 people involved in private banking. They have more than 2 million clients. And so, and $1 trillion of assets under management, most of which is cross-border. As we'll see, the top 50 banks in the world now have assets under management from cross-border investors on the order of $12 trillion. So this is the business that we're talking about. So if you think one leak from this Panama law firm was important, think what you would get if you actually got access to one of these major banks. Another myth that we've heard a lot about, and kind of a favorite question you get asked by journalists is this stuff legal? Well, technically journalists are not, we're not lawyers, we're not courts necessarily, we're not certainly operating the judicial systems. First of all, you have to ask, legal where? I mean, legal in Russia, legal in China. I don't think they'd probably crack down on this very hard. Their own people seem to be involved in it. Political leaders seem to be deeply involved in it. Secondly, legal is, sort of a moving barrier. We've seen really grotesque institutions like slavery and child labor. Over time, women's persecution, over time, those things have become illegal. So the boundary is shifting. And one of the other themes about this industry is that the players involved, don't take the law for granted. They have 1,800 tax lobbyists in Washington right now as we speak, working to re-engineer it. They've been there for a long time and have grown in influence. And these lobbyists are, not working for you and me. They're working for the largest multinationals in the world. They're working for banks, and they're working for wealthy clients like we've seen here. So, to take the law as the standard is to use a pretty slack rule of thumb in this area. I understand why journalists avoid calling it necessarily illegal, but as we see from the Mossack partner, he considered most of it a violation of tax law. But really, the real disgrace here is what is legal in many of these countries, and that's something we have to change. Modest size is another of my favorite myths, because I've been going back and forth with Piketty and Zuckman on the size and growth of the offshore industry. As you know, 2012 Tax Justice Network published my estimates, which were based on 3 different methods, and including looking directly at bank holdings, looking at the size of cross-border deposits and scaling that up, and then looking at capital flight and flight wealth from developing countries. So you can get pretty good estimates from 3 different directions that are independent of each other about what this global industry might be worth. And also in the case of major developing countries like Brazil and Argentina and Russia and China, we actually have a pretty good methodology that's been used for 40 years, to measure the size of growth of capital flight. And then now with this latest innovation in the models, to take account of the fact that this stuff is reinvested offshore. About 75% of it is reinvested and earns a very low rate of return. But you have to take account of that accumulated offshore wealth when you make these estimates. The estimates from Piketty and Zuckman throw all that out, unfortunately. And they don't, they rely heavily on an IMF survey that is very incomplete and led to an estimate of just 7.6 trillion as of 2014. Well, if you add up the current offshore wealth from Russia and China and Latin America alone, it's greater than 7.6 trillion. I mean, we have about 2 trillion of wealth from Latin America. Zuckman's number is 700 million, 500 million of which comes from Bermuda. We have 1.4 trillion from Russia and the Russian Federation as of 2014. Zuckman's number is 200 billion. We have about 1.3 trillion from China, even as of 2014, and we've seen that number surge in the last year and a half with more than $1 trillion of additional capital flight out of China. And his number for all of Asia is 1.3 trillion. So, it leaves out the Middle East entirely. That region is a huge source of offshore wealth. I think the basic bottom line is he's off by about a factor of 75%. I'll be presenting a detailed response to that in our own new estimates for 2014. The original ones for 2010 were 21 to 32 trillion of offshore financial wealth that is invested through havens. And most that excludes about 5 to 10 trillion of non-financial wealth, like real estate and gold and yachts and art. And we've seen those things turn up in the Panama Papers as well. All told, it's about 15% of global wealth, global financial wealth. And there's another area in which the missing wealth of nations is missing lots of offshore wealth. A McKinsey report 2011 quantified the size of the total global financial wealth at more than $212 trillion as of the end of 2010, when our estimate was made, at which point maximum amount was 15% of that number. That number seems to leave out all of traded debt securities and loans. So, it's just talking about public assets. Excuse me one second. I've got to get rid of this call. So. The second last myth here is that the U.S. is the largest tax haven. I first wrote an article in the Washington Post in 1989 describing the United States as a tax haven. So I'm certainly familiar with the argument And in a sense, we are. We allow, for example, non-resident aliens, sort of NRAs, people who are not resident in the country more than 180 days a year and have residency in countries like Mexico and Argentina, to basically live here tax-free on their capital income from stocks and bonds, interest on CDs. And, you know, that is an enormous loophole that has kind of a benefit to the banking industry and of great value to, you know, country elites that want to live in New York and tax-free. I mean, I can cite you an example of an individual I'm aware of who has a Park Avenue apartment. He has an island in Panama. He has a house in Geneva, a house in London, and a house in Cap d'Antibes. And he basically lives he's a citizen of nowhere for tax purposes by virtue of wandering the world from one place to another, you know, tax-free, following these rules for so-called non-resident aliens or non-DOMs. It's by far the most important aspect of our being a tax haven is that tax provision. It goes back to the 70s. In fact, the interest benefit goes back to 1921. It's been kept in place because despite I mean, it's an obvious case of hypocrisy for the United States to be decrying Swiss bankers who are coming here to raid the treasury by helping wealthy Americans make money, taking their assets abroad tax-free. It's an obvious contradiction of that for us to be doing the same thing with our banks servicing wealthy Mexicans and Latin Americans, people from all over the planet. But that is the case. Many of the Chinese investors who come to the United States have been careful to invest that way. So, you know, it's a huge contradiction in our basic values here. But it is true that the United States has become more and more of a financial secrecy jurisdiction. I don't think you'll see many kleptocrats actually going to Delaware to hide assets, Putin or his friends. They're still concerned about the law. We also have pretty tough anti-bribery statutes, which crack down much more than they do in Europe on bribery by corporate insiders. But it is the case that, as I said before, 13 states have these asset protection trusts. Nobody has beneficial ownership registration. And so from the standpoint of financial secrecy, we are seeing more use of Delaware corporations in global investments, as indeed one of the partners at Mossack Fonseca said. Where does he have his money? He's invested through Delaware companies because no one can find them. There's 1 million companies roughly registered in Delaware. State of Delaware derives about 25% of its annual revenue from registering these companies and trusts. And they're dead set opposed having beneficial ownership registration. In fact, the largest provider I've interviewed in Wilmington of these companies is about 1/3 of the market. You know, told me that, in fact, they're kind of thinking about providing beneficial ownership registration as a service because it would generate another opportunity for revenue. But on balance, his clients don't like it, so he's afraid of making the first move. I think if the industry as a whole were regulated in this area, we would quickly see a move to transparency on the part of the U.S. States. But it's a powerful lobby in Congress that's been blocking that transparency. Beyond our control is the final myth I would talk about with respect to offshore. I mean, there's a certain sense that, the banality of exposés, we've seen this time and again. At the end of the day, don't you just want to give up on having reforms? But actually, there's so many things that we have begun to work on to fix this problem. We've made a lot of progress just since the 2008 financial crisis. We've organized a so-called tax justice movement, which is now all over the planet, local organizations powered by citizens who are informed about this. They're concerned that basically if the rich are allowed to move their money offshore, wealthy companies are able to operate tax-free, then it transfers the tax burden to middle class and the poor. And so if you're not upset about it, you ought to be, because over time we've developed, especially since the 1970s, a much more regressive tax system, when the very top of the wealth ladder is able to take advantage of all these games and others onshore. So that's really what I think is at stake here, is a political struggle, not so much a technical problem. We can design all kinds of things, all kinds of solutions, and I'll go through some of them below. But the most important thing is to remind this industry that it's very hard for them to sleep with the lights on. And now we've turned on the lights, and you know, there's a lot of value in this transparency. So on that note, I'm going to pause now for some questions, and I've stopped the presentation and take some questions. Well, let me answer the first one. What is the impact of the Panama Papers in the U.S. laws such as FATCA, FCPA? FATCA, for those of you who are not technical with the acronyms, is a law that was passed in 2010 by the United States, which insisted that financial institutions that wanted to do business here would basically identify any so-called Americans in their client base and then share the information on their accounts or their interest and financial earnings with the U.S. Treasury. This quickly set off an enormous reaction because the United States, being such an important capital market, is able to exercise that kind of leverage. It was enforced by a 30% withholding tax. So that if banks didn't comply, or they didn't withhold against or didn't turn over information on specific individuals, they were supposed to pay that. So it was very expensive for them to do so, and most of them have complied. We're just beginning to get the data this year from FATCA about the level of cooperation. The problem with it in Europe is that when Europe tried to apply that same kind of automatic information exchange, is the title of the policy that FATCA implied just from the U.S. Treasury, they didn't. They copied the basic standards, and the OECD has been off and running with a similar kind of proposal that the G20 has now signed on to. But it lacks teeth in the sense that there's no withholding tax. And there's some other technical issues about the way automatic information exchange is defined. And there's a big issue with reciprocity with developing countries. So if you're Mexico, the U.S. Treasury has reserved the right not to share any information that they get from, from U.S. banks about wealthy Mexicans who might have money in U.S. accounts. But we're demanding that Mexican banks give us that information. Even though, the United States is by far a bigger destination haven than Mexico in the world economy. The U.S. shares the status of being a tax haven with, Switzerland and the UK from the standpoint of offshore non-residents or from people who negotiate special deals in the case of Switzerland to live there. Extremely wealthy people like Mark Rich, who negotiated sanctuary in Switzerland, is also a haven. But to come back to FATCA, basically the impact of Panama Papers, I think, is going to be dramatic here on the generalization of FATCA. The world community can no longer simply tolerate this kind of behavior. And one of the key things that has to happen is the registration of who owns companies and trusts. And you can have automatic information exchange, but if there's no beneficial ownership registration, and especially public registration so people can check the data, there's no useful information to exchange. So that is at the core of the demands that we've been making to clean up this system. So I think this kind of revelation will only accelerate that. Let me ask another great question. Why has TJN, ICJ, well, it isn't TJN's database, it's the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, and actually Süddeutsche Zeitung is the original custodian that's dealing with the leaker. I think the thought is that, you know, there's an awful lot of confidential information in that database, stuff that would be really easy to misuse from the standpoint of privacy invasions, and I mean from the standpoint of legitimate concerns about identity theft. For example, there's passport fixing, lots of passport data. There's you know, all kinds of personal information that just would, you know, be, I think, irresponsible for them to just dump all this on the world. And I think over time they'll be issuing more redacted versions of it after they've had a chance to go through and scrutinize this data for these concerns about identity theft and legitimate concerns about privacy. You know, some people have offshore accounts for very legitimate reasons. I hate to say that as someone who's been arguing about this issue for a long time, but the basic, you know, if you're, let's say, a political refugee who's trying to protect the wealth of their family, there may be a legitimate reason to have an offshore or onshore secret account. You know, I would say that the industry, haven industry, has been parasitic on that argument for decades. I mean, the Swiss banks used to argue that they were helping, you know, the Holocaust victims and their families by offering secret accounts. In fact, we found out after the fact that they were actually helping themselves to the accounts, and they ended up settling with Holocaust victims in 1998, represented by a major DC law firm. They still haven't paid the settlements, and in January of 2015, I met with a group of Holocaust victims and at a hearing that was determined whether Credit Suisse was to be allowed to retain its status as an advisor to U.S. pension funds despite pleading guilty to a corporate felony for helping Americans evade taxes. And they were making the case that no, they've never really been compensated in full per the agreement by Credit Suisse or UBS. So that issue goes on to this day. I mean, the idea that you know, a huge number of say Syrian refugees are taking advantage of Swiss bank accounts or Panama Papers type facilities is just ludicrous. What we did see was that a relative of President Assad was using this financial secrecy vehicle in Panama to basically buy weapons. So, you know, this is a sort of a phony argument. Let's see, what else do we have here? What is the legal basis for the disparity? What is the legal basis for the disparity between corporate trust taxation treatment and individual in the US? Corporations get a far more permissive treatment, cash accounting, also vis-a-vis havens. Well, I think it's basically, you know, it's not grounded in economic theory. It is grounded in political clout. And as I said, the 1,800 tax lobbyists in Washington do a good job for their clients. We'll talk a little bit later about some of the more interesting multinational uses of havens if we have a minute here. I see the time is now about, we're 40 minutes into our presentation. We have about 60 minutes to go. Let me see if there's, what could the World Bank, that's a good question. All right. Well, the World Bank and the IMF have a huge potential role to play in this issue, and I believe they are finally waking up to it. Christine Lagarde made a declaration this week about how important it was that the IMF World Bank annual meetings We had a vice president from the World Bank come and talk to a group of people worried about offshore havens at a conference at GWU last week. That's an opening. But when I talked to a deputy director of the IMF a couple years back about why it was that the IMF and the World Bank with their 3,000 economists, haven't done a single serious study of the size and growth of the global haven industry, that they've left it up to organizations like TJN and volunteers like me who, are very, are working nights and weekends on this stuff. Why there hasn't been more serious research from the institutions involved, or for that matter, from the U.S. Treasury or the IRS. We haven't really updated our offshore haven estimates since the 1970s. He said quite explicitly, simply put, there's more than 80 havens that are our members, namely IMF members. So there are a lot of countries around the planet that make a living from this. And I think one of the ingenious things about this industry is its ability to put to work all of these disparate havens in these international forums on their behalf, because no one wants to shut down Barbados. Barbados has 125,000 people. Only about 2,500 of them work for the haven industry or benefit from it. They have great Canadian tax treaty they've been profiting from for decades. But if you if you're the IMF and you go to Barbados, you're likely to end up bailing them out, as they did a year ago, rather than shutting down their haven, because at this point they're embedded in the industry and they're embedded in the IMF. Hope springs eternal. I'm optimistic that the IMF will stop doing just preaching VAT taxation around the planet. And when it comes to poor countries, start talking about all the huge outflows of wealth from many of the countries and the poorest countries in Africa. For example, we're seeing more than 668 billion of offshore flight wealth as of 2014 from sub-Saharan Africa, including more than 300 billion accumulated wealth from Nigeria alone. So, the IMF definitely has a role to play here, but they need to figure out how to square it with their membership. Let me sec. I'm not discriminating these questions. It's a problem just trying to read them. It'd be much nicer to talk to you folks. And I hope to do that in a more interactive kind of session. DOJ stated it will launch a formal investigation probe for U.S. citizens and urge individuals now to voluntarily disclose. In the past, the United States has had various kinds of amnesties for people who came in and cut deals with the IRS if they basically said fessed up. There are complicated rules and procedures. I think it's fair to say that if you're a great big bank, you tend to get off more lightly than individuals in this situation. So Credit Suisse in 2014 walked away with a $2.6 billion fine which was tax deductible in Switzerland, for essentially laundering money for 20 years with more than 600 private bankers and a secret unit calling on wealthy Americans. We have decried this tendency to focus on individual infractions in the tax area and not on the institutions that are involved. And I think that's an opportunity for us to improve the current policies. What are these accounts used for? Is this really about taxation? Well, as I said, we have the testimony of the Mossack Fonseca partner, who's labeled 95% of his clients as tax dodgers. But as I said before, there's also lots of other kinds of activities that are facilitated by havens. I'll stop using the term tax havens. Let me give you an example. We had during the Enron crisis back in the early 2000s, a major energy company called Enron went essentially bankrupt Turned out it had defrauded its investors, and with the help of major accounting firms like Arthur Andersen, it had more than 600 companies based in the Cayman Islands that were engaged in this kind of leveraged finance scheme that was basically made it hard for investors to figure out how much debt the company had. Similar stuff went on in the Cayman Islands. In 2008, we saw hedge funds, Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers, go belly up. And they were both had their hedge funds under-regulated in the Cayman Islands for good reason. Hedge funds in the Cayman Islands, I think Cayman Island hedge funds are now up to 90% of the world's hedge funds are based there. For good reason. They tend to be under-regulated. You can serve on literally hundreds of boards if you're a director of a Cayman Island hedge fund, and that's hard to believe that they're doing any kind of responsible oversight. Another game that they're involved in, I just was in South Africa, spent a month investigating a scheme that Morgan Stanley, in its wisdom, had come up with to sell phony tax credits to wealthy South Africans, and using companies in 13 havens, including the Caymans, Delaware, the Mauritius, and a bunch of others. Virtually an unauditable scheme on the part of the South African Treasury. They simply don't have the resources and the staff to try to audit these things, but maybe they can get some help from the IMF. You think the British firms based on equity make more use of tax havens than others? Well, that's a technical question. I have no idea. It's a good question. I wouldn't mind looking at that. Basically, Britain in this industry has a very important historical role. I think what we have is basically a multipolar industry from the standpoint of states, not only the United States, but also I think the UK and Switzerland have kind of led the world in this. And in the case of the UK, we have this spider net of havens all over the planet that have connections back to the home country. So it's probably the case that British firms use havens for lots of reasons. For example, if you're selling arms to a country that doesn't necessarily appear on the bestseller list when it comes to human rights, you can park a BVI company and then pretend that you're transacting by way of that company, and you don't appear directly. But there are lots of companies involved in that, not just British firms, although they have a huge arms sales business. The arms industry couldn't really exist without the haven industry for purposes of laundering transactions. I'm not sure that I understand this question, so I'll try to make sense of it. Really an offshore account on the line. Well, the real point here is that kleptocrats have been hiding wealth offshore without having to, tell much about its origins or even reveal it to their voters or taxpayers. Or if they have voters, they may not have them. In cases like dictators, Dos Santos in Angola doesn't really have a constituency to report to, but he, does seem to help himself to the treasury. There's clearly I think this is one of the most important things about the Panama Papers we're learning is just the sheer scope of the involvement of public officials, whether elected or not, in offshore chicanery. And, there's the case, near and dear to my heart was Lula in Brazil. Basically, it turned out that Odebrecht, the gigantic construction company, had set up a Panama company here that ended up owning his condo on the sea. And, Lula's someone I've known since 1989. It's just disheartening to see people I believed were terrific political leaders, and really were for a long time, but actually turned to this kind of behavior. But it facilitates lots of misbehavior by public officials. One of the proposals that we have is for a public declaration of wealth, both domestic and offshore, for all public officials. And that's something that's not even required of IMF officials at the moment. Let me turn back to the presentation, and I think we've taken a bunch of questions, and it's now 11:50, so we've got about just a half hour to go. I'm going to go through a few of the highlights, just so you get a clearer sort of sense of what we mean by what havens do. So as I said before, dirty money, kleptocracy, pirate banking, which is the helping wealthy people move offshore, and multinational tax dodging. That's a fancy term for something that I'll talk about in a minute, more detail. Human wealth flight, I think, is a huge emerging issue that I've just been studying in the last couple of years. We did the seminar at Columbia last year on Haiti, and it generalizes to the problem of the huge number of people that are living as a diaspora, have been driven out of many countries, and in many cases as refugees, or just can't afford to live in their home countries anymore, or moving to taking their families and moving abroad. They're finding that they're getting effectively taxed on all the remittances that they're sending back, in many cases by a bank-led cartel, Western Union, other local banks. In the case of Haiti, we had 6 banks involved in this, charging at least 5 to 15% after you add up all the costs of every dollar that poorest people on the planet are sending back to their home countries. I've written a lot about that lately, and it's something I'd love to have students involved in further study. We're doing a project now with Guatemala. Globalization of organized crime. My first encounter with the Mossack firm was, I mentioned General Noriega. And in that case, we identified Noriega as kind of in the vanguard of people who are globalizing the drug trade. I mean, he had acquired an airline that was sending a ton of cocaine every month right up the middle to Miami International Airport. And he did that for 4 years. So when he came to trial, one of the lead pieces of evidence against him was the fact that I had discovered this fellow who worked at his airline, who was a cargo manager, and was upset about everything in the country, and was a whistleblower, effectively. Well, Noriega had made all of his drug deals from the office of this airline, his international phone calls. So we assembled a complete list of all of the general's personal phone calls for 3 years. And that was a lead evidence in the trial in 1990-91 that sent him to jail. So that's an example of where you can actually fight back against the globalization of organized crime. But that's one of the themes here, is that crime now knows no boundaries, just the way tax dodging and kleptocracy know no boundaries. They veil themselves with the same kind of secrecy. Representation without taxation, I think, that's essentially the fact that you have, at the same time, wealthy people and companies have been paying lower and lower tax rates since the 1970s. They've also had more and more ability to use their wealth to acquire political influence. There's more to say about that at a detailed level of looking at particular lobbies. And I have quite a bit of information about that. But if anyone is interested in any of these topics, or wants to do a graduate paper or a thesis or something, I'm terribly interested in any empirical work on this. So kleptocrats I have known or investigated include these people. I won't go through the long list, but I'll show you a couple examples. One of my favorites. And we've written a lot about it. You can get more information about our research on this from them. What we're practicing here is something called investigative economics, which Professor John Tukey at Princeton liked to say, just look at the data. Forget the model building for a while. You can get to models eventually, but look at some puzzles, look at some mysteries, see what anomalies turn up. And you can spend a lot of time looking at models after the fact, but don't let the models tell you where to look. Look at the data directly. Furthermore, you know, things like methodological individualism are deeply rooted in economics, and I think in this sort of empirically driven approach to investigative economics, you know, if you want to know how someone feels, just ask them, you know, instead of the behaviorist idea that you look pretty good, how am I? You know, and most of all, just get up out of the armchair so you don't make mistakes like Piketty and Zuckman have been doing by never talking to a private banker. Otherwise, you end up with abstract empiricism. C. Wright Mills, a great Columbia professor, by the way, once described a lot of social science as abstract empiricism. Our approach here has been, to some extent, focused on this insight from Kelvin. If you really want to dramatize something, you need to make estimates of it. And that's, it's easy to talk about these stories qualitatively, but the real influence comes from having metrics to offer. In the case, one example I would say is, my favorite example is Larry Summers has just come around to this idea. So he's been advocating an idea that I had back in 1976, which is to call in big bills, which when you look at offshore currency, and about 80% of big bills, you know, US $100 bills, 500 euro notes, Swiss francs, are offshore, not in their home countries. You find an extraordinary phenomenon, which is that you know, a lot of this stuff is used for all kinds of nefarious purposes, not related to public weal, and there's no good excuse for having these very, very large denominations. In the case of the euro in its wisdom decided in 2001 to compete with the $100 bill for this business and to offer the 500 euro note, which is worth more than 750 bucks. The Swiss are worse. They have a 12,000 Swiss franc note, which accounts for 90% of their currency. You know, you look at where the euros were issued, and this is just one example of investigative economics. About 27% of them during this period of growth were issued by the Bank of Spain. Well, what goes on in Spain? The same thing that went on in Florida and California and Texas when I first looked at this big bill phenomenon in the 1970s. You know, it was basically facilitating all kinds of drug trafficking. And it's a disgrace that we haven't recalled these things. I hope Larry Summers now finally, you know, does what he should have done 10 years ago when he was Secretary of the Treasury, 15 years ago. This example I'm going to start with just quickly because I think we've talked a lot about the many different roles that havens play, but I want you to have a graphic example that you can live with every day you go to the grocery store or eat fruit. And we'll start with this. We've got a couple films that you ought to take a look at if you're interested in going deeper. One is We're Not Broke. It's available. Both of these are available on Vimeo and I think on Netflix as well. But let's take the global banana industry. Here we have the case of Chiquita, which produces bananas in Ecuador at an export price of 20 cents a pound. Of that, they pay about a penny and a half of taxes, 16 cents of production cost, 2.5 cents of labor costs, and then they send them to the Brits. They end up in Britain at an import price of 91 cents a pound. So there's a whole lot of markup on this between the 20 cents that they're exporting and the 91 cents that they're importing them for. Well, where does that go? Why don't they pay a big tax on their offshore revenue from that net of costs? Well, ultimately, they have set up a chain of wholly owned captive companies. And about 60% of the world's trade today goes through captive companies. So they have their Cayman Islands company that charges 12 cents a pound for the purchasing network. Their Jersey, Isle of Jersey company charges 6p for management services, 26 cents a pound for the use of the The Bermuda-based distribution network, the Isle of Man provides insurance for 6 cents. Luxembourg, 12 cents for financial services. Ireland, 6 cents for the use of the brand. So the bananas end up not paying very much tax because they have all these intermediate companies that are draining off the differences between the export price and the import price. And that's what captive companies based in havens routinely do for commodity exporters based in that are multinational companies.
It's 12 hours.
Note that there's no way to make intelligent audits of this. Let's say you're the UK Treasury. You'd have to send tax investigators to all these various havens to take a look at. And then under the current standard, the so-called arm's length pricing standard that we all learn in law school, the OECD has propagated, that my law professor, Stan Surrey, was a big author of back in the US Treasury days when he was writing the code. This arm's length standard assumes competitive markets. And so, of course, as economists, we know that captive markets are, in sort of wholly owned intra-company transactions are almost prima facie evidence of the lack of competitive perfect markets. And so it's almost impossible to find comparable numbers for replicating the purchasing network in the Cayman Islands for Chiquita's bananas. How do you do that? But there is an enormous business about this, trying to do what's called comparability studies for private clients as well as for governments to make these kinds of bogus calculations. And this is one of the things that the OECD has been looking at. This trying to get beyond this artificial arm's length pricing standard. The problem is you have so many vested interests in this. The major accounting firms, the law firms, this is what they know and love, and they really believe in this orthodoxy. It's very hard to shake it. It has no grounding in economics, and almost every economist I know, including Joe Stiglitz at Columbia, has been critical of this approach, and we're looking for an alternative. The U.S. Domestic sales companies used to have this game of planting all of their sales in Delaware. And so if you were Walmart and you had sales in New York, you just tell New York State, go check our subsidiary in Delaware. And by the way, Delaware doesn't charge any income tax. So it was a haven for domestic sales in the United States until the states said enough of this. We're going to start allocating corporate taxes on a unitary basis for this whole company in the United States, and we're going to look at activities in different states, and maybe sales, maybe assets, maybe employment. But most states have looked at sales as an allocative device, but at least there's a formulary apportionment that makes, basically in the world system, it would cut out the havens from having any share of this kind of profit. And for us to get to that system, the Panama Papers is about individuals, mainly kleptocrats and tax dodgers who are individuals. But there is some evidence that we're now beginning to see as we get further into it of some of their firms facilitating what we call mispricing of exports and imports. And I'll give you a couple examples of that under the current system. So basically what we have is a world economy in which, quote, the invisible hand, Adam Smith's idea, is nowhere to be seen. There are no competitive markets for most of the internationally traded goods that we see. There's a lot of captive companies for which there are no corporates comparables possible. Take the case of Zambia, which is one of the victims of havens. And this really does raise the question about why the World Bank and the IMF have not been more concerned about this stuff, because it really does affect development. Zambia is a big copper producer. And if you look at Zambia's copper exports, it turns out that, as we see on this chart, virtually all of their exports go to Switzerland, according to their official exports. But when you look at what Switzerland says it imports from Zambia, mainly for a company called Glencore that has acquired a big stake in the Zambian copper industry, at least in this period. You find that Switzerland reports no copper imports from Zambia. None, zero, zip. Well, where are they? This is a case of over invoicing of exports. You see, usually you think of under invoicing of exports to avoid taxes, but in this case, the issue is Zambia's copper exports are flowing through the British Virgin Islands through a Panamanian company set up, lawyer set up the company in the British Virgin Islands. So, this is a case of where all of the income is being parked by the owners in Switzerland in an offshore haven with no taxes. And so if Zambia got the same price for its copper that Switzerland did, its GDP would increase substantially. That's just one example of where poor countries are getting completely screwed by this haven system. And they can't audit this system. It's unauditable. So Switzerland does this for a living. This is just one of the things that Switzerland does for a living. Goods misinvoicing by trading partner. I mean, Russia, China, even the US, Kazakhstan, Peru, South Africa. Zambia is not alone. Tremendous amount of over invoicing of exports in which you just don't see the imports on the Swiss side. They're being parked offshore. Let me generalize this to some other institutions, my favorite players in this business. This is going to be kind of the last set of slides I want to talk about here in any detail. I have a lot more to say about this issue, and we really should. If there's any interest on the part of students, I'm happy to come and talk to a seminar in real time, because I think that's the best way to have this kind of dialogue. I did a summary of the financial crimes that have been committed by the top 22 banks in the world since 1998. As you know, you've seen, especially last year, there was an enormous flurry of plea bargains and settlements. A lot of this grew out of the 2008 financial crisis. But when you look back and sort of took stock, nobody had actually added up the numbers and said who was doing what. And so this chart, which is included in your slide, in your slide deck if you download it, is an attempt to summarize by bank all the major infractions that they've been involved with, all the settlements that they've been involved in for misbehavior, and then take stock of how many infractions there were, and then look at how much the fines have been, how the fine process has worked. Because one of the things that's problematic with this global system that we have for the haven industry is this network of impunity. For the financial crisis, you've seen nobody go to jail, virtually no bank shut down for any of its misbehavior. Nobody lost their licenses. No senior executives were really disciplined. You've seen fines be the main thing that's happened. And these institutions, top 22, paid a grand total during this period of $280 billion of fines. And these were for 14 different offenses, from aiding tax cheating, as we talked about before, to LIBOR rigging, to money laundering, to mortgage fraud, to rogue trading, sanctions busting, wrongful foreclosures, foreign exchange rigging, rigging the muni bond market, rigging LIBOR, sorry, I mentioned that, securities fraud, energy metal market rigging, bribery, lending, credit card fraud, a grand total of 655 infractions by these top 22 banks, an average of about 25 apiece. And this means that they're not just rogue operations or rogue behavior by isolated few individuals. These are recidivist institutions that are basically involved with a serial kind of criminal enterprise. I think we have to worry about that. Here's an example. You can read more of all the different things that major US banks, the largest in the world, are engaged in. Let me just see. I think I've flipped up to quickly. I'm not going to be able to go through all this today. I want to come back to that one point, though. Sorry. I'm sure you would have stopped me if you'd been there. But yeah, this is the point. The fines basically came very late in the process here. So you committed the offenses that generated all the revenue back in 1998 to 2000, and the cash flow that was rolling in then as a result of all these behaviors. That's when you took the profits, and the actual penalties, even if they were levied, were paid very late in the day. And so the costs of all this on a business, on a sort of a basic cash flow basis, it's a profitable business to be involved in financial crime. It looks like, if you're a major bank. We have the deputy attorney general for the Justice Department in 2011 was asked why there were no more prosecutions. He said, well, we just don't want to, we're afraid of having these institutions fail. They're just too big to jail. And this alternative, which is just to levy fines that can be passed along to customers, basically paid so late in the day that they have no effect on the people who are originally involved, is unlikely to make things better. Well, I've been talking for a while again, and I'm going to go back and that's about enough of the presentation. But let me go back to some of the questions. I would say this about the point about banker impunity. There's a real issue about what we do with a firm like Mossack Fonseca. If we just penalize this tiny Panamanian law firm, I think they probably deserve some rich rewards. But the point is that they are not just one bad apple. That this is a behavior that thrives on a network, and it's easy to target them. Delaware, for example, has a corporate registry just as large as much larger, I think, in fact, than any registry in Panama, and about the same scale as the BVI. Well, what do we do about the havens themselves? I don't know. I feel a certain amount of sympathy for the ordinary people in these places. As I say, in Barbados, for example, a country I know well, they only a tiny handful, maybe 0.5% are actually benefiting from this haven directly. I think we have a responsibility to wean them off this. Sort of this polluting industry, and over time to help them adjust to this kind of artificial hothouse environment that they've had. But we're talking globally about probably less than 5 million people living in tax havens, and they're imposing enormous costs. They've been doing it for decades. On the rest of the world. So this is really a classic case of externalities where the benefits are rather limited. Here's a good one. Let me talk about some of the solutions. I mentioned automatic information exchange, the beneficial ownership registration, country by country reporting so that multinationals have to declare how much tax and how much income and revenue they're actually paying or generating in haven X, Y, Z. They're very much opposed to that, especially to publicizing that data. The U.S. Treasury has, in fact, gotten on the wrong side of the OECD because they've been resisting having a public declaration of country-by-country reporting for multinationals. And it makes sense because the biggest firms in the United States are many of the bad players, and Google and Microsoft and Apple and Pfizer have been parking intellectual property in Bermuda and Ireland and the Netherlands and paying themselves royalties tax-free. I mean, this is a classic game. And they're not denied access to the money. It's not sitting offshore. They're able to borrow against it. So there's a lot of games being played with this offshore money, but they're now demanding a tax break on repatriating all this 2.4 trillion that the U.S. multinationals have parked offshore. which is not taxable until they bring it back. The problem with that is that it's essentially, we're talking about repealing the corporate income tax. We're already down to about 6% of federal revenues for the corporate income tax. In 2004, we tried this experiment. President Bush gave a 4% tax rate, 5% tax rate rebate for those who brought back offshore money. They created, virtually no jobs. There was a lot of shareholder buybacks. It just was not a good example of what happens when you, provide a one-time sort of tax amnesty for this behavior. I think the move broadly has to be toward an international tax system that makes more sense. William Simon once said, it would be nice to have a tax system that looked like it was designed with some purpose in mind. And the current system just allows and rewards all this artificial entity parking, using places like BVI and Caymans and Jersey and Netherlands. I mean, the top 8 companies in Ireland today are corporate inverters that came from the United States. It's really the Irish, the occupation of Ireland by American capital under another guise. They're in Ireland just because of the tax rates. So basically, we need an end to this kind of global tax competition that's been driving on the multinational level. The United States cutting taxes or threatening to cut taxes. Canada responds, then the Brits respond. So gradually over time, you have a kind of race to the bottom that's happened with the corporate taxation around the planet, rather than countries basically figuring out a global system that makes sense and has corporations paying a fair but not confiscatory level of taxation, and allowing developing countries a bigger voice at the table than they get with the OECD. Well, I'd love to talk to you about the Zambia slide. I'm not sure how general a question that is, but basically, if you're adding up misinvoicing, and it's a measure of how much exports Zambia is, in particular, is showing, and Switzerland is not. So it's basically under invoicing of Swiss imports. Which list? Let's see. No, I don't think there's too much focus on, the problem is we have lots of different havens. What we really need here, in terms of things we can do, in addition to stiffer penalties on, these kind of technical changes in reporting requirements, we have, like beneficial ownership and, the automatic information exchange country by country. Just to continue with my list, I think we need tougher penalties on the enablers. That's the industry that's behind all this and, is generating. And so there's only 22 banks that are actually big players in this business. That we can have quite a bit of impact just by regulating them more tightly. I mean, facilitating tax dodging or helping public officials hide their wealth, that ought to be penalized in some way. And I think that's the only way we get at it, more directly. And at the moment, I think the time is right for a big investigation, international investigation of this whole industry. As we saw, the revelations that came out here were not produced by governments or by, Congress or, law enforcement. They were produced by hardworking journalists. I mean, I've been doing this for 40 years. I'm kind of tired of doing it. I would like government to finally act and clean up this thing, because it's such an obvious, glaring eyesore on the world economy. And it's basically a good time for an international commission to investigate this across borders and to take a look at big players as well as tiny Panamanian law firms. Germany won't create public beneficial ownership registry. Critics say it isn't transposing the EU. Yes, I mean, there's a big debate going on in Germany right now about public beneficial ownership registration. A lot of the tax movement people feel very strongly about this measure. People in law enforcement I talk to say it would be helpful to have a more public registry, because then you could have whistleblowers and one of the big technical problems here is just who's going to make sure the data is right. I mean, a lot of these companies go out of business and they disappear. Is anybody going to clean up the database? Who's going to take charge of that? If you have NGOs around, at least they will plunge into it and see, what's there, instead of relying on private eye of government agencies and the lobbyists to look at this data in secret. So I'm all in favor of the publicness of this thing. On the other hand, beneficial ownership is a technical solution. It is hard to define precisely. Mossack Fonseca specialized in creating, for example, foundations with no beneficial owners. Officially, they belong to the Red Cross, and then they'd swap the board of directors and have the owners, calling the shots. So there's a lot of games that can be played with dating, and with who the foundations ultimately belong to. What a beneficial owner even is. So I would prefer to lean more heavily on the investigative side of this, because I think we're going to need it as a complement to any of these transparency initiatives, and to start with this global investigation. Well, Bitcoin seems to be moving pretty much against itself. It hasn't been doing very well as an investment lately. It's not clear. There's a whole complicated literature now on blockchains and all that stuff. It's not clear who's going to end up making use of this stuff. But the lack of transparency in that market has been a serious concern. Cash, is a reliable secret weapon for the organized crime, and they're used to it, moving suitcases around. It just mystifies me that we have facilitated this effectively by having all of these large denominations, which are a much more reliable, government-certified, tangible version of Bitcoin. So invest in cash while it lasts until we get Summers to recall it. There's a lot of arguments about who is providing what in Germany. I'm not equipped to deal with, but Markus Meinzer of Tax Justice Network is the world's leading authority on, certainly on Germany's regulations. I would put you in touch with him if you're interested. Let me just give you my email address, if in case anyone is interested in corresponding with this, because we're running out of time. About 8 minutes left, and I've got a lot of questions. Thank you for staying with me, the 31 people, 33 who I'm seeing online. What percentage? Yeah, the round tripping is an interesting issue. This gets down to the question of where the money ultimately is, and this is ultimately kind of a metaphysical issue. I mean, a lot of the companies that have been set up for wealthy Chinese have been reportedly round tripping the money back into China, which was a healthy, what was growing. It's still growing, but I mean, when it was growing at a much higher rate. So the same thing may go on to a much lesser extent with countries like Russia. I don't think it's a very big factor in many other havens, but certainly in the case of China, it has been a factor. Lately, we've been seeing lots of China money coming into Vancouver real estate, New York real estate, the art market. I mean, anything outside of the country they can get their hands on. But I think the issue in a way is spurious. Ultimately, people are not investing in these havens. The havens themselves, the offshore havens, nobody's putting their money in Panama. the funds are all coming back to major Western capital markets, the United States, Switzerland, the UK in particular, but also the German capital market is filled with offshore company money. So, in fact, the developing world as a whole, when we did the calculation, is a net creditor for the first world to the tune of at least 10 trillion after you net out the offshore flight wealth and the official reserves that they own, nearly $8 trillion of government reserves from their gross foreign debt. They're basically net creditors. They don't have, the key point is, their problem is not for most countries, most middle-level developing countries, their problem is not a debt crisis, it's a taxing crisis, and it's a crisis of kleptocracy. And that's the problem that they're facing that's been aggravated by the Panama Papers behavior here, or the behavior that's been shown by the Panama Papers. Anyway, I invite you to get in touch with me if you're interested in talking more about this, and I've enjoyed presenting this. Let me see if there's any more burning questions that we think. Is the sensation surrounding the leak a sign of the end of neoliberal globalism? Well, I think neoliberal globalism has a life of its own, but it is, I think, a turning point in our understanding of the dysfunction of this global industry and how the time is right for us to do a few simple things to try to clean it up. This is ultimately a law enforcement problem. There will always be crime. There will always be tax dodgers. There will always be corrupt officials. But when you see entire governments that people look to for inspiration and leadership, like Brazil or South Africa, basically democracies that are turning toward this path of increasing corruption, kleptocracy at home and abroad, and making use of these instruments to do so, this is certainly a sign of the end of our naivete about neoliberal globalism. But it's, I think from that standpoint, like 200,000 tax lawyers at the bottom of the ocean, a really good start. Thank you very much, everybody.